Hello, everyone. I'm going to give it another 30 seconds or so before we get started. All right, in the interest of time, we can go ahead and get started. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Environmental Law Institute's webinar, Climate Compliance versus Action 2023, an update on buy clean emissions, LCAs, EPDs, and funding. My name is Madison Calhoun. I'm the Senior Manager of Educational Programs here at ELI. I wanted to give you a warm welcome to today's event and thank you for joining us. We really appreciate your time. I also want to give a huge thank you to our fantastic speakers who put time into preparing a great program for you all today. So thank you so much to our speakers for their time and energy. At the end of today's webinar, there will be time for an audience Q&A session. So if you have any questions, please put them in Zoom's Q&A box. You may submit your questions as soon as you think of them, though. There is no need to wait until the end. You can just put them into the Q&A section anytime throughout the event. Should you have any technical issues during the webinar, please message me or send me an email at calhoun@eli.org. I now briefly want to introduce all of our speakers for today. First, we have Bill Kaplan, who's our moderator and presenter today. After a 34-year career in high technology and with an engineer's understanding of sustainability, Bill Kaplan studied the built environment from an environmental perspective for more than a decade, contrasting designers' claims with their ecological veracity. A sober look at our efforts to contain global warming inspired Bill to write Thwart Climate Change Now, Reducing Embodied Carbon Brick by Brick, published in 2021, his third book. Bill has a materials engineering degree from Cornell University and a Master of Architecture from Pratt Institute, Graduate School of Architecture. Next is Ken Berlin. Ken is a senior fellow and the director of financing and achieving cost competitive climate solutions project at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center. He has devoted his career to leadership on environment, energy, and climate change issues. From 2014 to May 2022, Ken was the president and chief executive officer of the Climate Reality Project, an organization founded and chaired by former US Vice President Al Gore, and Ken Berlin was a co-founder with Reed Hundt in 2010 of the Coalition for Green Capital, an organization that works with governments at the international, national, state, and local levels to establish green bank finance institutions to accelerate the deployment of renewable energy, energy efficiency, and clean transportation. Ken has served as the chairman of the board of the Environmental Law Institute, the Center for International Environmental Law, the American Bird Conservancy, and RARE. He also founded the Wildlife and Marine Resources section in the US Department of Justice. Ken is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania and Columbia Law School. Up next, we have Fatou Jabi joining us today. Fatou is an IT professional with experience in fieldwork and integrating smart technology systems for large corporations. She's the principal at USL Technology, a New York City-based sustainability and energy efficiency firm that provides regulatory compliance, engineering, and technical advisory service to real estate developers, property management firms of large multifamily, hotels, supermarket, restaurant, and commercial buildings. Prior to pivoting in energy and sustainability, she has over 15 years in data center IT network design and systems engineering expertise in the e-commerce, wireless telecommunications, and financial sectors. In her work at MTA's design and construction division, she works on design build projects, energy code compliance, engineering plan reviews, and whole building energy simulation modeling. She's a graduate of the Sustainability Management Program from Columbia University and holds an undergraduate degree in computer science from Kentucky State University. Our next speaker is Chris Kardish. Chris is the Industrial Fellow at the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, where he works to advance industrial decarbonization through research and policy advocacy, including through the Renewable Thermal Collaborative, a coalition of large energy users focused on reducing emissions from heating and cooling at their facilities. And last but certainly not least, we have Keith Kilpack, who manages SCS Global Services Lifecycle Services Department and Environmental Product Declaration Program. Under his supervision, the department conducts life cycle analysis assessment for a wide range of industries and clients. Studies are conducted to help companies design products and services to minimize environmental impacts, optimize operational efficiencies, satisfy customer requests, engage stakeholders, and support comparative eco-labels and environmental product chemistry or declarations. He draws from prior experiences in environmental chemistry and applied biology, validation of environmental analytical data, environment remediation projects, and sustainability. Keith's master's thesis reviewed international environmental health and safety and product stewardship practices in the nanotechnology field. So thank you so much to all of our speakers for being here today. We so appreciate your time. And before I turn things over to Bill, I also wanted to quickly give a quick mention about his book, Thwart Climate Change Now, Reducing Embodied Carbon Brick by Brick. It is available from ELI's website as well as on Amazon. So please check it out if you're interested. Additionally, Bill held a webinar about the topics covered in his book last February with ELI. I'll put the link to the event in the chat in case you're interested in watching the recording back. So thank you so much, everyone, and I will turn things over to Bill now.
Thank you, Madison, and thank you, ELI, for hosting this webinar. And a special thank you to my co-panelists, Ken Boleyn, Batu Jabi, Chris Kardish, and Keith Kilpack. You want to take the slides off, Madison? Madison? Thank you. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us. Just a brief note on the Q&A at the end. There's going to be a soft ending to the webinar. It's scheduled to end at 1:30, but we're going, if we have questions that we can still answer, we've added on an extra 15 minutes if we need them. Today's webinar includes updates on buy clean policies, EPDs, funding, and the status of global emissions. Viewed in the context of timely climate action, it will reveal one glass half full and another glass half empty and possibly leaking. Our panelists' presentations will focus on new regulations in the pipeline. This will be followed by a panel discussion to explore potential issues of compliance and the efficacy of its impacts. A year ago today, the Environmental Law Institute hosted a webinar, What Climate Change Now? Reducing Embodied Carbon Brick by Brick, to discuss my recently published book. Back then, embodied carbon emissions were mostly taken for granted. They were a normal cost of doing business that was too perplexing to resolve. Fighting global warming was relegated to replacing fossil fuel energy with sustainable carbon-free sources, which is a long-term endeavor, and to use less energy in the meantime by designing energy-efficient buildings, appliances, and transportations. Well, in a little more than a year, things have changed. Embodied carbon is now at the center of a new category of regulations, Buy Clean. Buy Clean initiatives are working their way through an increasing number of regulatory bodies. Why? Because embodied carbon constitutes approximately 11% of the world's energy-related emissions. And because embodied carbon is released to the atmosphere up front, before a building or an infrastructure or a product is first used. If you are new to embodied carbon, in simple terms, it is merely a product's carbon footprint. For Buy Clean policy, the initial concern is from cradle to gate. In other words, the carbon emissions released while fabricating a product from its raw material extraction to the manufacturer's shipping dock. If you are advising large corporate clients, you might be discussing embodied carbon already in terms of upstream Scope 3 emissions. In the fight to thwart global warming, this glass is filling up, perhaps half full. Without further delay, Chris Kardish will start us off with an update on Buy Clean policies in the pipeline. In doing so, he will introduce you to the new buzzwords, Environmental Product Declarations, EPDs, which form the basis for Buy Clean compliance. Chris, it's all yours.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Madison. Thanks, ELI, for having me. I'm going to provide a sense of the state of play of BiClean before we get into some specifics from other presenters, going deeper into other areas. So next slide, please. So Bill already covered a lot of this, but just, so we're on the same page. When we talk about embodied emissions, we're talking about those across all the stages of a product's life cycle, but most of the attention, particularly on BiClean, is focused on the stages around manufacturing, which includes the raw materials that are used for that manufacturing. And I'll use the terms embodied emissions and embodied carbon interchangeably. As Bill mentioned, we're talking about 11% of global emissions embodied in infrastructure and buildings from common materials, particularly steel and cement. And this additionally matters because materials, steel and cement in particular, are among the most ubiquitous in our economies, and looking sort of beyond just their emissions from the built environments. Those two sectors account for 15% of global emissions. And when we're talking about BiClean, we're talking about ideally shifting broader markets. So embodied emissions are those from our purchases and our consumption habits. And so when we're talking about policies to address them, we're talking about more sort of the demand side of the equation. And this is certainly true of BiClean. And when we talk about BiClean, broadly speaking, we're just talking about attempts by governments to put limits on the emissions content of materials that are sourced in public projects. And there's a reason for this strong emphasis on public projects, because about 32% of embodied emissions in the US are from construction of public projects. At the same time, we know that to have effective policies, we need ways to reliably measure the differences in emissions between manufacturers to actually sort of empower those choices and sort of deliver the promise of public procurement, which is ideally shifting broader product markets toward lower carbon goods by leveraging that buying power. Next, please. And so the leading way of measuring the embodied carbon for construction materials is through environmental product declarations, or EPDs. Keith is going to talk a lot more in depth about this, but just so we're all on the same page, EPDs provide a range of environmental impacts in a standardized document, including the CO2 equivalent emissions per unit of the product, which is referred to as global warming potential. EPDs are grounded in sort of guidelines, overarching guidelines and principles that are set by the International Organization for Standardization. These are the sorts of things that can apply to measuring the embodied emissions of any product, so broad principles. And then more granular product-specific rules that are known as product category rules spell out the finer details of measuring a specific product. And in fact, the measurements for the same products must have used the same product category rules in order to be comparable, because otherwise you're not looking at an apples to apples comparison. And these product category rules are generated through stakeholder processes that include industries themselves, manufacturers themselves, and are administered by program operators, which are often companies that specialize in third-party verification. And there are different types of EPDs, some of which have emerged from BiClean laws themselves. Industry-wide, provide an average across a range of manufacturers. They're often produced by industry trade associations as sort of a first step before more specific EPDs are available. And they can be useful for sort of setting thresholds for sort of maximum allowable greenhouse gas emissions. So getting a sense of where an industry is. Then product-specific EPDs, like they sound, provide specific data on a manufacturer, but the data might be averaged across multiple facilities of that manufacturer, but they provide a representation of that manufacturer. Taking it a step further, facility-specific EPDs can actually be traced to a single facility of a manufacturer and were introduced in the BiClean California Act. And lastly, supply chain specific EPDs require the use of primary or actual data for certain materials and upstream inputs. So directly from the supplier in this case. And so, for instance, requiring data on cement that's used to make concrete, because the cement is a very emissions intensive component and you want the actual data. This was introduced in the Buy Clean, Buy Fair Washington Act, which didn't become law, but has become influential. Next, please. So Buy Clean laws are emerging at every level of government, but they started in the states and they're particularly active in the states. California was the first in 2017. The Buy Clean California Act requires the Department of General Services to set firm emissions limits on a variety of materials that could be used in public projects, including a variety of steel products, flat glass, and mineral wool board. In some cases, these categories are further sort of subdivided because there's a lot of variation within sort of sub-products in these categories. And the state requires facility-specific EPDs for compliance. California took a bit of time to get to the implementation stage and face some challenges, particularly around sort of setting these thresholds through a collection of facility-specific EPDs, and finding instead that they needed to largely rely on industry average EPDs that were more sort of representative and reliable. Other states have followed suit in recent years, including Colorado and Oregon, who've set somewhat similar laws, but with differences in the types of EPDs required. So they require product specific, for instance, products covered, they're covering concrete off the bat, and then just different approaches or timelines to setting the limits on embodied carbon. Another set of states, like New York and New Jersey, have set more limited Buy Clean laws. So I put them in somewhat of another category. In this case, they only cover concrete and have not been quite as firm in sort of setting these thresholds on emissions content. Washington and Minnesota have been very active and have considered laws a number of times, but in the meantime have commissioned studies and pilots and could be expected to follow suit soon among the Buy Clean states. And then, we're certainly likely to see more laws floating in state houses this year. We've seen, last year we saw them going through Virginia, Illinois, Maryland, among others. Not meant to be a comprehensive list, but certainly likely to see more of that this year. Next, please. And so under the Biden administration, Buy Clean has really accelerated at the federal level, which is important because that's where we really need to reach scale, to reach greater scale. And the Buy Clean Task Force was established in 2021 via an executive order as an interagency group that's really focused on formalizing a federal policy around key aspects, including covered materials and EPD reporting requirements. They issued a set of priority products in September last year, and then a month later established a 7.1 million program through the FHA that's working with state level departments of transportation on pilots, demonstrations, ways to really sort of build capacity there. The GSA was the first federal agency to act on Buy Clean. They set standards on concrete and asphalt purchases in March of last year, and compliance on that has begun and has reportedly been quite successful so far. And then
Chris, yes. We're sort of running a little bit overtime here, so if you could.
Oh, sure, I can wrap it up. But yeah, so the IRA, of course, has a number of other big programs, including efforts by the EPA to really improve EPD data quality and reliability and harmonization, as well as creating a labeling program to sort of broaden knowledge and sort of ease of information around this. And then to GSA and the FHA to really make these purchases, which often could come with a green premium when you're really trying to target ultra sort of best-in-class performers. Then last slide. So yeah, states and localities have all, localities and cities have also stepped into the mix. Portland is sort of among the only cities with a sort of formal Buy Clean law targeting concrete with specifications that have limits on the emissions content, and compliance obligations that started this year. So they've actually moved ahead of the state of Oregon to move first on this. New York City issued Executive Order 23 last year, requiring capital project agencies to make their best efforts to incorporate low carbon concrete rules and to begin collecting EPDs for concrete and steel. And then some localities have looked to target this issue by encouraging recycling and reuse of construction materials, by, for instance, setting sort of debris recovery requirements on city projects. So San Francisco and Cook County, Illinois, be among these. And then lastly, some are taking the approach of addressing this issue through the building codes themselves, and so not as much from a procurement lens. And this includes, Marin County was the first, but Denver recently issued some amendments to their building code along these lines. So with that, that's it for me.
Great, thank you, Chris. Chris wrote a paper, a building block for climate action, reporting on embodied emissions, which may be of interest. It addresses the importance of EPDs to the success of bike-cleaning initiatives. Chris, could you post a link to that in the chat box?
Happy to.
Okay. Most people on this planet have never heard of an EPD. Fewer have ever seen one. We are fortunate to have with us Keith Kilpack, Technical Director of Environmental Services for SCS Global. SCS is one of the world's leading EPD program operators. Keith will give us a short primer on environmental product declarations. Keith?
Great. Well, thank you, Bill. Thank you, Madison, as well as Chris for that introduction there and preview into EPDs and product category rules. Really appreciate being invited by ELI to speak with you all today, and looking forward to sharing with you the perspectives from a program operator on life cycle assessment and environmental product declarations, and how it ties in with some of these buy clean legislations. Madison, I think I have control here, but I'm not. Okay, there we go. Great. Just really briefly about my firm. SCS is an international leader in third-party environmental and sustainability certification and standards development. SCS specializes in auditing, testing, certification, verification, life cycle assessment, and EPDs, as well as training and strategic consulting. And SCS helps businesses, governments, as well as NGOs meet government regulations, stand out in their markets, as well as demonstrate environmental and social responsibility. You can see here some of the areas which we work in support of sustainability. And SCS is headquartered in Emeryville in the San Francisco Bay Area, but you can see that we have offices globally. So with that, let me dive in here into the discussion with a little bit of background on life cycle assessment, or LCA. So typically we think of this as a cradle to grave exercise, looking at the impacts of a product, a process, or service as well, but looking at that over its entire product life cycle. So that would begin with the extraction of raw materials or recycling of materials in some cases, the processing and refining of those materials, to a manufacturing facility where a product's manufactured, packaged, and then distributed to customers. You can also quantify the product use phase as well as the end of life. And throughout the life cycle, we're looking at impacts to various environmental areas, such as what we're talking about here today, to climate change, but it looks at other areas too, such as depletion of the ozone layer, pollution to water, such as eutrophication or acidification, sometimes referred to as acid rain. There's a number of other areas, but LCA attempts to be more holistic in looking at a range of issues and not just climate change, for example. A little bit of background on the benefits of life cycle assessment. It represents the most comprehensive tool and technique for measuring environmental and human health impacts. It can also be used as a cost-effective and environmentally efficient to identify environmentally efficient improvements. One really great thing about LCA is it can be applied before making physical changes to a manufacturing process to try and investigate where you might be able to have opportunities to reduce those impacts. One of our what we really appreciate as life cycle assessment practitioners is some of our clients are interested in understanding the environmental hotspots along their supply chain, or maybe it's the manufacturing process. For some products, it might be other life cycle stages, such as the use or end of life, but it's really important for understanding where these hotspots are if we're going to be able to take actions towards reducing those. LCA can also be used to demonstrate, or for a company to demonstrate commitment to health, safety, and sustainability. It can also be used as a way to transparently communicate to customers and stakeholders. And an environmental product declaration is one of those applications. LCAs can also be used to substantiate consumer-facing claims that might be made in the marketplace, as well as helps a company manage risks. So just real briefly on how an LCA comes together, following the ISO standards, there are four essential stages. The first is the goal and scope definition. This is where the product system is identified, the system boundaries are selected, the level of data quality that's going to be necessary for the life cycle assessment is defined, and the indicators to be reported, for example. Then in the next stage of an LCA, the life cycle inventory stage, this is where we collect all of the data and environmental inputs and prepare a virtual representation of the product, typically done using LCA software, but it can also be done using tools such as Excel. And then the third stage of an LCA is the life cycle impact assessment stage. This is where we take all of those environmental flows and environmental data and process those to quantify the impacts to the environment, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, things like impacts to climate change and other environmental areas. And then the final stage of the LCA is to document the LCA in a report, including the analysis and interpretation of results. And an EPD is essentially a kind of a derivation of this fourth stage here of reporting. So there are four key ISO standards. I'll just mention these briefly here, and Chris alluded to several of these as well. So there's two foundational standards for lifecycle assessment, ISO 14040 and ISO 14044. This is a general framework that should be applied for all lifecycle assessments, and it can be used for different applications from, internal design research, environmental product declarations, comparative LCAs, wide range of uses. And in 2006, ISO 14025 was finalized. This standard laid out the rules for EPD program operators, development of product category rules, and this idea of environmental product declarations as a way to communicate the life cycle impacts of a product to customers. And then I also included on here ISO 21930. This has been more of an emerging and important standing for the building and construction product sector. ISO 21930 kind of sets a foundation for these rules for PCRs for construction products to try to create more parity when we're looking at products from different categories. So just a little bit more background here on how the EPD comes together. First, there must be a product category rule which is established. This lays out the rules of the LCA and the format for the EPD. Once a product category rule has been prepared, that gives the guidance for an LCA to be conducted and documented in a background report. And again, this will have all of the information, the background information that would go into the environmental product declaration. And from that LCA report, and the environmental product declaration, or EPD, can be prepared. It's essentially a transparency disclosure based on the lifecycle assessment report. It is prepared using a standardized format based on the product category rule and following the ISO standards. An EPD, it should be noted, is not a comparison in and of itself. ISO is very explicit about that the EPD should not be making a comparison, but it can be used to make comparisons easier. And that's one of the intentions of ISO 14025, is to help guide decision-making on purchases. And EPDs must be independently verified. So I wanted to share this with you for those of you that may have looked at an EPD for construction products at some point. But ISO 21930 and this European standard EN 15804 have developed this idea of life cycle stages, or life cycle modules is actually the term that they'll use. But this breaks down the life cycle of a product into various stages, and that's so that users of the EPD can repurpose that information in their own projects. Maybe they want to model a whole building LCA. But let me just give a little overview of this. Initially, we have the product stage. So that includes A1 through A3. And that includes the raw material extraction, processing, transport to a manufacturing site, and manufacture of a product. Then we have the construction stage, transport to a site, as well as the installation of the product. And then there can be impacts during the use stage, whether it's from use or various activities to maintain the product, such as maintenance, repair, replacement, refurbishment. And then if a product uses energy or water, that can also be, impacts from that can also be reported under the use stage. And then this is followed by the end of life stage, which includes 4 modules: the removal of the product or deconstruction from the building, the transport to a waste processing site, any waste processing or sorting that's necessary, and then finally the end fate of the product, either in a landfill or it's incinerated. In this diagram, you can see these X's here, which you may often see in an EPD with this type of table. This would indicate to the user that all of these life cycle stages are included in the EPD. This would be considered cradle to grave. Okay, and then I'm going to animate this here a little bit. This is a different scope. This would be what we would use the terminology cradle to gate, just looking at the manufacture of the product. And this is relevant for today's discussion, and I'm speaking more from the perspective of Buy Clean California, but only the product stage modules are relevant under that legislation for the GWP calculations. These downstream stages are outside the scope. And I just wanted to highlight a nuance of that. It can even be a little bit more complicated, at least under Buy Clean California, for steel products, in that the final fabrication of the product is excluded from the global warming potential calculation. So that means that when you're looking at these EPDs, you really have to understand, are you looking at that for, let's talk about rebar for a moment. If it was fabricated rebar, we would have the reinforcing bar in A1, transportation to a fabrication shop, and then the fabrication of rebar in A3. But from the perspective of Buy Clean California, they're actually only focused on the impacts from making the reinforcing bar, because that's where 90+% of the climate change impact occurs, is actually from that steel mill. So just a word of caution when interpreting these, you do have to be careful to know which stages are relevant to the legislation. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Bill.
Keith, 2 quick questions. For a client who, manufacturer who wants to produce an EPD, and so we're really talking cradle to gate, your A1 through A3. What's a typical time frame from start to finish if they came to SCS?
Great question, Bill. Yes, we're quoting about 4 to 6 months for a typical project to complete. Some of these projects do take longer, though. I do want to acknowledge, because there is a data collection component on the manufacturers or the client's end, and so as long as that comes through together in a timely fashion, though, we can typically get these completed in about a 4 to 6 month time frame.
And what's a typical range for cost for something like that?
Mm-hmm. It would vary from product to product, and since there are several reviews in the LCA, there's a lot of upfront costs. So if there's multiple products or multiple facilities, these costs aren't linear; they go down quite significantly. But if you're just looking at a single product manufactured at a single facility, the cost started about $15,000 for working with SCS, and of course there are other EPD program operators that will give you their own information on that.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Keith. Fatu Jabi, the founder of USL Technology, sustainability and technology consulting firm, will talk about helping designers and construction and building operation professionals to find a solution to decarbonization. Fatu, it's all yours.
Thank you, Bill. Madison, can we go to the next slide, please? Hello, everyone. So I think the general consensus here is that my previous colleagues basically set the stage that the current landscape at the federal level, state level, city level, and municipalities, EPDs are starting to be the requirements when it comes to a mandate perspective. An example was given with the General Services Administration, which is also prioritizing federal buildings from a new construction perspective. The same sentiment in the current landscape is happening here in New York State, where I work and live, and also in New York City. And generally, public agencies are leading by example and integrating EPD requirements and embodied carbon, addressing embodied carbon within publicly funded projects. Existing frameworks are being leveraged, as shared previously by my colleagues, in terms of ISO standards, LEED, which I will talk about in a little bit, that was incorporated in our Executive Order 22 with New York City. And also, we're talking about design and construction. It's pretty complex. We're looking at our existing environment of the building envelope, architecture, engineering. There are known gaps in our existing frameworks, and these are the realities that we're going to have to deal with. But at least, given what we know, there are different solutions that would fit different design and construction projects or major renovations. Next slide, please. This is just a code I got from Architecture 2030 that basically shows how much embodied carbon accounts for emissions in construction and where that's going to get us in the next decade if we don't do anything, and operating business as usual means that embodied carbon is going to grow up to 70%, 74% in the next decade. Now, in order to address that, this will require a concerted effort across different municipalities at the federal level. And that's the very reason why both New York City and New York State, as of last quarter of 2022, have implemented Executive Order 22 and Executive Order 23. Next slide, please. Just a little bit, this language comes right out of their Executive Order 23 law. What I want to share here is that this is going to require collaboration across the legal field, architects, design engineers, to really understand what these executive orders are asking us to do. And that the requirements are nothing new. Like some of these frameworks have been around since 2015. So there's been a lot of foundation that we can build upon. New York City is committed to carbon neutrality by 2050. And in there, it's counted that 23% of our global greenhouse gas emissions comes from embodied carbon, which has already been shared. Can we go to the next slide, please? Again, we're talking about embodied carbon from cement and manufacturing, which 8% of that contributes to global greenhouse gas emissions. And approximately 7% of that comes from embodied carbon from iron and steel. And that runs across the manufacturing, transportation, installation, maintenance, and disposal of these building materials. And again, I think what I find very interesting across the industry is that we're now starting to address the building envelope, which is the biggest opportunity that we can, as a city and as a nation, focus on to be able to have a bigger impact and get us to our 2030 goals and our 2050 goals towards a low carbon economy. Next slide. Now, in New York City, building materials is what we're focusing on, and construction equipment. Again, the city is leading by example to encourage market development and the uptake of low embodied carbon products and materials in our clean construction strategies. This is, again, applies across all disciplines: architecture, engineering disciplines, the legal discipline, for design and construction projects to really start looking at this type of conversation at the planning stage to be able to determine what pathway needs to be taken to identify the compliance path to these mandates. Next slide. So capitally funded projects in New York City, there's specific city agencies that handle capital construction. And these are the dedicated agencies that my team and our clients are looking at: Department of Design and Construction, Citywide Administrative Services, Environmental Protection, and Parks and Recreation. At the state level, the state has also identified over 75 agencies and authorities that need to comply with the state's Executive Order 22. And I'll share a little bit more about that in a couple of slides. Next slide. When does the executive orders apply? You know, when there's a substantial reconstruction required on some of these federal city and state funded projects. Their laws define what those substantial renovation is and what a new construction is. And also what I find very, very excited about is that a lot of these buy clean new construction laws and executive orders are piggying back off of our existing energy codes and our building codes to incorporate that so that compliance can be a little bit slightly easier for industry professionals when they're starting to look at these projects. So the definitions and the requirements are piggying back off of what already exists to help mitigate some of the confusion that most design and engineering teams may face down the line trying to identify EPD products for their projects. Next slide. Life cycle assessment was talked about, PCRs was talked about, EPDs were talked about at a high level. Those foundations have already been established, the frameworks have been established. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. But the objective here is that, for example, with Executive Order 23, it is leveraging LEED as a framework, which is Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. This is a voluntary rating system. LEED has been requiring EPDs in LEED projects since 2015. Envision is another existing international framework for transportation and infrastructure projects. The city integrated Envision framework in there as a means of compliance with the city's Executive Order 23. And New York City Green Schools, this is New York City School of Construction Authority, which is a capital city agency, has their own LCA framework that they've been using since 2018. So there is an opportunity here for design engineering teams, developers that are bidding on city and state projects to really understand what these frameworks are being asking of them in order to be able to integrate that into their design process. Next slide. This is Executive Order 22 at the state level. Decarbonization and sustainability is the main goal here. And it's already being mandated that starting January 1st, 2023, that every single project would have to require EPDs in new construction projects. And it also defines what constitutes as a significant renovation or and when the EPD requirements will kick in. The law also specifies how design teams, both internally at these state agencies or with the private developer and design engineering firm partnerships, need to do their own calculations in terms of LCA and give it out to the bidders so that they can know what parameters they would need to use to submit environmental product declarations when it's available for their projects. Next slide. The scope of EPDs were talked about, and I wanted to elaborate on this a little bit because there's specific different categories that may be applicable to some construction projects, major renovations, and some that may not be applicable. Based on city or state agencies that the private sector is working with, they're going to have their own internal specifications. If a project would require a cradle to gate EPD or a cradle to side EPD, and again, if it's a design bid build project, certain EPDs may work for them. And if it's a design build project, certain EPDs may not work for them. So the complexity is there, and the direction to take will not be straightforward or obvious to most, but just the collaborative nature of looking at the legal aspect of it, looking at the design and the engineering aspect of it will help set the stage and make it easier for project teams to comply with these mandates. Next slide, please. So cradle to grave, we talked about on this presentation a few times, and a lot of projects are currently following that. I have an example of a project that the New York City School of Construction Authority have implemented where they use the cradle to grave EPD scope. And next slide. You could do 2 clicks and it will just highlight a few areas. Okay, so I just want to highlight here that if projects, EPDs are being required for bidding, there are product-specific EPDs, which was touched upon. Design teams would have to be a little bit more specific as to what do I put into my RFP proposal request. And that would help set the stage in terms of what materials they would be able to source to meet the requirements and the LCA calculation limit that the project needs to meet. Now, the path forward here is that we have our current status of where things are. And the path forward is really going to require for us to do a lot more due diligence to be able to meet some of these mandates. Next slide. I talked about, this is just a high level table I put together based on what New York City is requiring, leaning on the LEED rating system, which has been around since 2015. You could do 2 double clicks and it would just highlight 2, yeah. New York City School of Construction Authority, a lot of design engineering firms who have worked on LEED projects or have worked on New York City design and construction projects may have already been subjected to some of these requirements, but going forward, it's going to be a lot more granular to help the city meet its 40% carbon emission reductions by 2030, which is less than 7 years from now. Next slide. So this is School of Construction Authority. In my little digging, I basically looked at some of the information, how they use the EPD requirements and how it focused on the building materials that are used around evaluating materials for building envelope and its assemblies. So objectively, they're using an LCA assessment that is through Athena, which I haven't used before. But again, there are lots of different tools that are available in the industry. Some are much more complex than others. But depending on the city or state agency and what their specifications are asking for, that's going to determine what type of EPD project teams will be considering to be able to meet that embodied carbon emission cap or limit that the project needs to meet. Next slide. Just a screenshot of that same study or project that the SEA did, looking at project materials that are on site. This is all building envelope materials. And when we talk about new construction, pretty much it's been done. Now we just need to scale it and be able to meet some of our larger embodied carbon emission goals. And next slide.
Too, we're running to be a little bit over.
This is probably the last one. So this just shows the complexity of all the different stakeholders when it comes to looking at the materials that goes in a construction process. There are trade organizations, policymakers, design engineers. We can do it, and the pathway is already there, and we'll be able to basically rely on those and solidify the specificities on how do we validate these EPDs to make sure that we're accounting for them in a way that counts towards the goals that we're trying to meet. Next slide. This is a label of an EPD. I mean, I think, Bill, you and I talked about this before. We want to get to a place where it's really easy to identify some of these materials in a way that you would look at your food label. We're not there yet. But the previous slide that I showed in terms of all the different organizations that it takes to get to a label like this, it's going to take a little while, but eventually you have an interior design project team go into look at a product, be able to select it without going through the complexities that we're currently faced with in the market today. Next slide. There you go. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Fatou. Ken Berlin has weighed in on environmental issues from his tenure at Skadden Arps to his 7-year term as president and CEO of the Climate Reality Project, to his new role at the Atlantic Council. He worked on everything from clean coal to no coal to green financing. Ken will talk about avenues that are coming available to fund decarbonization. Ken?
Thank you, Bill. 1 second, I'm trying. Thank you. And hello, everybody. I'd like to start off by just saying a word or two about my organization, the Atlantic Council. I've only been here for about 2 months. The Atlantic Council works on a series of global challenges and covering many, many different areas. And they cover the energy area through the Global Environmental Center. At the center, we work with NGOs, we work with business groups, we work with governments on energy and climate change issues. We have a staff of about 18 members, and we have 58 fellows. I'm a senior fellow and a resident fellow. There are a couple of resident fellows here also. I'd like to start off by just stating that what we've really been talking about today is reducing embodied carbon emissions through buy clean programs. It can be business-to-business activities. It can be other kinds of programs, all of which are informed by EPDs and PCRs. So they're informed by disclosure. I thought it'd be important to take a step back before I get into funding issues as to really what's happening in areas like cement and steel, because the environmental product disclosure could be reporting a 5% decrease in emissions or a 50% decrease in emissions. So it might be a little bit helpful to know where we are. And I picked out two categories to talk about that: reducing emissions from steel and reducing emissions from cement and concrete. Steel generates about 24% of industrial CO2 emissions in the United States. And worldwide, I have down 8%. I think Fatu O'Keefe said 7%, but basically about 7 or 8% of total global emissions. If you look at the chart on the right side, the big orange disc is emissions from a traditional blast furnace and basic oxygen furnace. The two discs to the right, which are much smaller, are emissions from electric arc furnaces using either syngas, the bigger one, or hydrogen, the smaller one. We've made progress in the United States because we are producing a significant amount of our steel from electric arc furnaces. It's about 69.2% of crude steel in the US is produced from these furnaces and 30.8% from blast furnaces. As you'll see in a minute, the profile around the world is very different than that. But we're still, steel is still producing 24% of all industrial US emissions. So through technological innovation, fuel switching, energy efficiency, and other measures, we're likely to see in the next decades a continuous decrease in the amount of CO2 emissions from embodied steel. Worldwide, about 75% of crude steel is produced in high carbon emitting blast furnaces globally. As you'll see, the vast majority of that right now is from China. We expect this line to even out over time, India to start producing a lot more. But there will have to be more of a conversion away from crude steel or, from blast furnaces or other measures to reduce the carbon impact from those furnaces. And McKinsey, in a report published in 22, estimates that this will cost about $4.4 trillion to decarbonize the entire industry. If we look at cement and concrete, we can see pretty significant progress here also, although still a long way to go. An RSI study said that 80% of concrete manufacturers reported already producing or supplying low embodied carbon materials. Very significantly, 55% said that they could do so at a cost competitive nature with conventional concrete. Now, again, there's a way to go. We're not every step of the process, but where we are so far is working out pretty well. And 60% have developed a product-specific EPD. And the GSA has used this information from EPDs and elsewhere to develop new standards for purchasing, as someone said, from concrete and asphalt manufacturers. But again, concrete has a long way to go. If you look at this chart, the second line from the bottom is where we would be in 2050 with business as usual. And the remaining lines on that show the amount of reductions people think, McKinsey thinks you can get today from various measures, like from energy efficiency to alternative fuels. And you'll see there have to be a lot of things done, and there'll be a lot of things done over the years ahead. All this means we're in a very dynamic environment when it comes to EPDs and PCRs, because the underlying products will be changing and hopefully becoming less carbonized fairly rapidly. I thought I might spend a minute talking about my views on the use and value of EPDs. First of all, they provide useful information for government and other regulators to set minimum or required environmental specifications for products, and also for bidding and other aspects. They enable purchasers to make informed selection decisions and buy less carbon-intensive products, a critical role in their work. They allow parties to assess emissions, not only from embodied materials, but as we've been heard, but also emissions from the entire product. So EPDs can and will play a very, very valuable role going forward. The cost of EPDs, we heard, I think it was Keith talking about the cost. He obviously does it, so he's got better data than I do. We looked at specifically for EPDs back in 2017. Now, these probably are obviously not full life cycle assessments. And at that time, the costs ranged from $13,000 to $41,000, and they took about 22 to 44 person days. Obviously, we think those numbers would go up over time. And as we've heard, the costs include things like registration, data collection, life cycle assessments, or EPD, report generation, verification, et cetera. To turn to funding now, I think Chris mentioned that there's specific funding for EPD-related activities in the Inflation Reduction Act, $100 million to create a selection program, and $250 million for grants and technical assistance. Those are actually pretty significant amounts of money, I think, for the issues that they're covering. $250 million to help manufacturers develop and verify these, I think, can be a very, very valuable addition to the industry and to how these products are developed. There's also direct funding in the Act for Buy Clean programs. And again, that's critical because it provides the demand for, helps provide the demand for EPDs, helps push companies to develop more carbon effective, efficient products. The bill includes $2.15 billion for a federal buildings fund to buy cleaner materials, $2 billion to the Highway Administration, and as was mentioned previously, $7.1 million for state work at the Highway Administration level. FEMA also provides incentives for various low carbon and net zero energy products. So what we're seeing now is to some degree a market developing before all the regulations and standards are in place. And I think that's actually a pretty healthy development. There's additional funding. The bipartisan infrastructure law includes a carbon reduction program of $6.4 billion for projects to reduce transportation emissions. Very significantly, it includes $9.5 billion for hydrogen initiatives, because clean hydrogen can play a significant role in reducing industrial emissions by replacing fossil fuel-based sources of energy in the production processes. The American Competes Act includes $1.8 billion to DOE for energy-related supply chain activities and $1.2 billion to expand manufacturing capacity in the United States on these kind of products. So with that, let me just summarize what I've said. I've tried to keep this short given the time, but first of all, I think significant funding is available. It's a big process, though. As we saw, it's going to cost $4.4 trillion. McKinsey says to address steel emissions alone around the world. But this funding will be very, very helpful to what we're talking about today: Buy Clean programs and developing of EPDs and PCRs, and in getting Buy Clean programs off the ground. Progress is being made to reduce industrial emissions and therefore embodied carbon, but there is a long way to go on that, in doing that. Government should continue to standardize PCRs and streamline EPD certification. So we're always talking about apples to apples in the work, in what we're looking at. And I think most importantly, what we're seeing is a very, very dynamic, we will be seeing a very, very dynamic environment where we should be seeing continued reductions in emissions from embodied products like steel and cement. That means there'll be an incentive for companies, a positive incentive, not a government requirement, but a positive incentive to constantly update their EPDs to reflect the fact that they're using products that are less carbon intensive. I think that's all very, very healthy. And so we have an area where we have a dynamic process going on. We have disclosure that's effective and becoming more effective. There are incentives in the disclosure process for people to continuously update their disclosure as products become more carbon efficient. And with that, I'll stop, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Ken. My presentation is on the status of carbon emissions and the status of our progress towards slowing global warming. But before I start, I would like to recommend a source for more Buy Clean information. May I have my first slide, please, Madison? Nope. You have Atlantic Council. There you go. Okay, great. Okay. The Carbon Leadership Forum has a website full of excellent resources. Check out carbonleadershipforum.org. At the top of their homepage, click on toolkits. You'll find toolkits for embodied carbon policy, for building owners, and for architects. And no, I am not affiliated with the Carbon Leadership Forum. Okay, thank you. Madison, next slide, please. Whether you are attending this webinar for an update on compliance requirements or attending because of your interest in climate action, the state of global warming is where to begin. Real-time emissions provide the context in which buy-clean initiatives must be evaluated. The context in which buy-clean initiatives must be effective. Like it or not, by the end of this decade, the level of atmospheric carbon dioxide will likely determine our fate. Time flies. Only 7 years remain in this decade. This is not my own offhand assessment. It comes from the opening remarks made by UN Secretary General Guterres at COP27. They were particularly blunt. Next slide, please. Quote, we are fast approaching tipping points that will make climate chaos irreversible. 1.5 degrees is on life support. We are dangerously close to the point of no return. The climate fight will be won or lost in this decade on our watch. Why is the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal on life support? The answer can be found in the carbon budgets. Next slide, please. This table was included in the Climate Change Report 2021 from the IPCC. It illustrates the remaining carbon budgets to achieve the Paris objectives with their likelihood for success. The carbon budget estimates the cumulative CO2 emissions allowable until net zero is achieved from the beginning of 2020. Holding cumulative emissions to 300 gigatons afforded an 83% likelihood of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, as you can see in this chart. Next slide, please. Here we are, only 1 year later. There is no such carbon budget table in Climate Change 2022. Instead, the forward greets us with the following statement. Unless there are immediate and deep reductions across all sectors, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius will be beyond reach. In the summary for policymakers, a footnote elaborates. This implies that mitigation after 2030 can no longer establish a pathway with less than a 67% probability that it will exceed 1.5 degrees C. In other words, without deep reductions now in the 2020s, the likelihood is that we will exceed 1.5 degrees even with carbon gas emission mitigation. At our current rate, we will burn through the 1.5 degree budget in 2027, only 4 years from now. Next slide, please. Let's take a look, a reality check on the trend of annual CO2 emissions worldwide, and more importantly, on the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the factor that induces global warming. The black line shown here traces the annual carbon dioxide emissions released from fossil fuels and industrial production. The blue line traces the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in parts per million. The trend is obvious, but let's take a closer look. Next slide, please. This blow-up reveals the reduction in new emissions in 2020 due to the COVID shutdown. It's highlighted in yellow. A reduction of more than 2 billion tons of carbon dioxide for the year. But look at the blue line, the level of atmospheric CO2. It continued to climb. Why? Because CO2 emissions remain in the atmosphere. They are not reduced as emissions decrease. They will remain in the atmosphere for centuries. To flatten the growth of atmospheric carbon, we must reduce emissions now, annually. But as you can see from this graph, annual emissions have already returned to their pre-COVID level. Waiting for the 2030s to start flattening the curve is wishful thinking. Next slide, please. NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, created a series of slides that correlate trends in global phenomena with a steady increase in atmospheric CO2. And as you can see from this chart of theirs, the continuous climb is clear. Next slide. This is a graph of the ocean's heat compared to its average. A steady increase over the last 30 years tracks that of atmospheric carbon. Next slide, please. The trend line shown here for a yearly glacier mass balance is not surprising. Unfortunately, it's a continuous measure of glacier mass loss over the last 50 years. Next slide, please. And with that, the upward trend for the global sea level. Unlike chaotic weather conditions, which vary locally, which come and go, these global trends continue in the same direction. Next slide, please. Fortunately, 2022 has seen significant movement in climate action initiatives and significant movement to provide climate action funding. The IRA will have a major impact over the long term, providing support for electrification, clean energy, and buy clean initiatives. But time is of the essence. The timeline to reduce emissions effectively is everything, which depends on the tools and the databases they analyze in order to make an impact. Next slide, please. The second part of this webinar, the panel discussion, is about compliance versus impact. Compliance to a regulation by itself will not stimulate an effective climate impact if the regulatory basis is unsound. I've asked our panelists today to address potential hurdles inherent not only to compliance, but also to the performance of buy clean initiatives within this decade. Madison, can you please stop the screen share and take down my slide? Okay, thank you. So let's start the panel discussion. Chris, the first question goes to you. You stated in your paper, there are numerous ways that EPDs and the data they rely on fall short, which presents hurdles to making product level reporting more useful and widespread. Please elaborate.
Sure. Thanks for the question, Bill. I mean, so there are a few things that come to mind. So first, they often lack primary data for important upstream sources of emissions because product category rules don't require this often. So for a lot of products, but especially concrete, many others though, this is really significant because it means you're using generic data for major sources of the emissions and then kind of making the EPD less useful in distinguishing between manufacturers. Second, there can be issues with comparability, even between products that follow the same product category rules. That's because they may use different sources of generic or secondary data, or even sort of different LCA software tools. There's a need to use generic data to some extent because there's just so many different inputs and processes you're measuring. But there can be inconsistency there. And then I guess lastly is just the sheer availability of EPDs. It tends to vary a lot by the sector and the state. So states that have been active on embodied carbon policy, of course, tend to have better availability. But for some sectors, it's limited even in these states. Products like masonry, aluminum, wood products to some extent. And so in the availability of these even more sort of granular EPDs like facility specific and supply chain specific is of course more limited currently. These are things that are not spoken of really in product category rules and are relatively new ideas introduced by clean laws.
Thank you, Chris. Keith, can you explain why EPDs for the same product type may be based on different rules, databases, and software tools? As a result, they cannot be compared?
Yeah, a great question, Bill. Yeah, I mean, communication of LCA results can be complex. Users need to use caution when trying to compare EPDs. This is something that's reinforced in the ISO standards and some of the PCRs, and is even stated on many of the EPDs to use caution when trying to compare EPDs. With that said, though, ISO 14025, one of the intentions of that standard is for EPDs to guide decision making and help improve purchasing decisions. So we've outlined 3 areas where there could be a potential for differences when trying to compare EPDs: product category rules, software and databases. Maybe starting with the product category rule. The ISO standards encourage developers of these standards, these product category rules, to harmonize, which means that there's multiple program operators in North America, as well as a number of them in Europe. When developing a new product, a rule for a new category of products, we need to look at what is already out there existing in the marketplace. If there's already a sufficient standard, we should not be duplicating that. We should be, or if there's good justification, a new PCR might be developed with justification. And so we've done, I'd say within the EPD program operator world, that we've done a pretty good job of not duplicating product category rules within regions, although there are situations where there's a different set of rules, for example, for steel products in North America as compared to Europe, and that could be said for a number of different categories. So that can be concerning, because these are going to lay out different rules on how to conduct the LCA and the indicators to be included. However, I think the good news for today's discussion, and I'm speaking more from the perspective of the Buy Clean California Act, is that it had decided that there can only be one PCR per class of eligible material that can be used to be an eligible EPD. And this avoids the issue of having multiple product category rules that might be used for those EPDs. So that was an important decision the state had to make in that case. In the case of databases, there's been a growing number of LCA databases out there, software as well, and there can be some differences in how these databases are put together, or even with the software, with how some of the calculations are done. But I think, again, the good news here is that when it comes to the indicator that we're discussing here today, the global warming potential indicator, this is the most consistent indicator, I would say, across databases and software, and is the most comparable one. If we were looking at other indicators, there might be, I would raise additional concerns about the software and databases. However, focusing on the climate change indicator is more consistent and more reliable for comparison across EPDs.
Thank you, Keith. The purpose of Buy Clean is to reduce embodied carbon. The embodied carbon benchmarks and regulations will rely on the EPDs. Therefore, the veracity of the EPDs of the database is paramount to success. This opens the door to an important line of inquiry. The Buy Clean California Act requires that limits be set at the industry average of facility-specific values, which are to be computed from the EPDs. The California Department of General Services has stated that environmental impacts from a facility-specific EPD must be attributed to a single manufacturer's specific production facility. Why? Can you put up a slide for me, please, Madison? Slide 14, actually, is on my. Nope, keep going. Yes, right there. Thank you. This slide shows the embodied carbon emissions from an insulated metal panel product manufactured at 2 different facilities of a single manufacturer. The California's plant's panels are responsible for 35% more emissions than the panels produced in Florida. Perhaps due to the materials suppliers, manufacturing efficiency, energy sources, or other factors. If a manufacturing plant submits an EPD derived from average industry-wide data, its own emissions are not being disclosed. Most concrete product EPDs use industry average data with caveats included to cover the cement component of their emissions. Next slide, please. Please note, a single product is responsible for 8% of all energy-related emissions, cement. Buy Clean California does not cover cement yet, but it will, as will others. However, GSA, the General Service Administration, does. The GSA issued new low embodied carbon concrete standards for all GSA projects. They require prime contractors to submit EPDs that meet the maximum emissions specified in the standards. A simple enough statement, but let's track the regulations source. GSA's limits reflect a 20% reduction proposed by the New Building Institute. And this is where it gets complicated. So please try to follow me on this. It can get a little bit confusing. The New Building Institute collected over 36,000 ready-mix concrete EPDs from the Building Transparency Database to evaluate concrete emissions. The data was compared to industry average data, which was supplied by the National Ready Mixed Concrete Association. According to the National Ready Mixed Concrete Association, industry average EPD, they sampled only about 6% of the 8,000 concrete plants in the United States who volunteered. Let's take a look at one of the caveats on a typical ready-mixed concrete EPD. Next slide, please. Quote, cement LCA impacts can vary by as much as 50%. Cement accounts for as much as 90%, that's 90%, of the impacts in this EPD. Cement impacts could result in variation of as much as 45%. Does that mean 40% higher or 40% lower? If the cement was delivered with an EPD, which disclosed its own emissions, then what's the problem? Why would there be a 45% uncertainty in the concrete mixture it was mixed with? A regulator might consider this transparent and compliant. After all, it is currently acceptable. But an engineer might consider it valueless. As of January, nearly 80% of all EPDs in that database were for ready-mixed concrete products, more than 83,000. But just 3 companies constituted half of them. Most of them had disclaimers like this or other warnings in the fine print, but not all of them. Some of them were pretty good. Does this disproportionately impact averaging? Does creating EPDs with a sampling of industry-wide data to produce more EPDs based on the same become self-perpetuating? Is this data mining or data creation? Building Transparency's database tool does an excellent job in mining the data and making it accessible. It provides the bandwidth for emissions levels and calculates the mean, the average, and various percentiles. But the veracity of Buy Clean regulations depends on the qualities of the EPDs that the regulations are based on, which leads to my next question. You can take down the screen share, the slide. Thank you. This is a 2-part question. First, should benchmarks and maximum emissions be based on EPDs like these? Second, what are your thoughts on the role of industry trade groups in developing the rules and formats for product data disclosures where there may be an element of self-interest. Ken, let's start with you.
Well, it's the bottom line of all this is that companies and EPDs have to reflect, or should reflect, the most accurate information they have available. And if they don't reflect that accurate information, then of course they start raising legal problems for themselves, both in people they're selling their products to and potentially with the government. Trade associations, if they're doing this work, have a pretty high standard they have to meet as a trade association in looking at that. And if people then examine what they've done, and it turns out that what they've done is inaccurate or misstated or exaggerated or something like that, then they create a whole series of issues for themselves and for the companies that potentially rely on what they're saying. So in my view, this comes down to there's a responsibility in everybody to come up with, accurate information, accurate analysis. If they fail to do that, they potentially face consequences, including legal consequences when they do it. And the people who rely on the information they receive, if they've done proper due diligence, they've relied on it, they may be okay in one sense, but they could lose a contract because of it. They could have all kinds of problems too, and therefore they could wind up having actions against the people who gave them the underlying data that wasn't effective.
Keith, what's your thoughts on this?
A few comments here. I agree with both Ken and Bill that EPDs should have the most accurate information available and tailored to the supply chain. I'll give some examples of where this can present challenges. I'm less familiar with concrete EPDs, so I'll speak with a couple examples of steel rebar or cold form steel studs. So these are smaller shops that manufacture these final products for their customers, and their supply chains are not coming from just one single steel mill, right? Due to redundancy, or maybe they want to have the advantage of having different options for cost reasons, they may have a very more complex supply chain. And maybe they have a half dozen steel mills supplying their steel coil so that they can produce steel studs or providing reinforcing bar to create fabricated rebar. So it becomes a challenge is how do you create an EPD for a company with a very complex supply chain? And there's going to be some variability, and some of their steel might be coming from an electric arc furnace and some may be coming from a basic oxygen furnace. So from that manufacturer's perspective, it's as accurate as possible, but they're not able to tell you for one piece of product what steel mill it originated in, because there's a lack of chain of custody within that industry. And that may be something that is going to be important going forward, is to have better traceability from where these materials are coming from. So I'm not trying to excuse these companies that are using more generic data, but sometimes there's challenges. That's all I wanted to highlight there. And then the second part of that question was about the role of trade associations with developing these EPDs. Yeah, I mean, the challenge, we do see value in that. I mean, these trade associations can represent a large group of manufacturers and help smaller manufacturers in particular be able to have an EPD for their products where they might not be able to have the resources to develop one on their own for some of these larger industries. But absolutely agree with Ken on the importance of the veracity of these efforts, because they can create major issues if there's as these EPDs are scrutinized.
Fatu, how do you feel about that question? You're not on there.
I think looking at it from a city and state compliance perspective, a city verified database or a state verified database of EPDs at some point would have to come into effect. We're not there yet, but also a lot of city and state agencies in New York have their own specifications when it comes to materials that goes into design and construction projects. That I think will need to set precedents for design engineering firms that are working on public projects. With that combined, naturally you have the different EPD types that are meant for design, product specific EPDs, cradle to gate type EPDs. Those would have to go into proposal requirements to help sort of contain that different options that already exist in the market and industry today.
So what can we do to make this system better, to improve the efficacy of the Buy Clean policies? I mean, clearly, to have Buy Clean policies that are going to depend on a small sampling of EPDs, which may not reflect anything other than some industry average, you'll end up with working on an average. And then we have the issue of differing standards. What can we do to make this work better and sooner? Because we're running out of time. So, Chris, could you shed some light on your thoughts?
I think a big part of that will come from the federal government acting as both a large buyer and a standard setter. And then having a lot of that filtering down to states who are just sort of beginning to pass, states and localities that are just sort of beginning to discover these laws, because only California at this point has standards in place. So there's a real opportunity to for the government to, for the federal government to really come in here and make a big impact. I think particularly because of the scale we're talking about. So I think the Buy Clean task force will need to move rather quickly to encompass sort of all federal purchases, and ideally something with longevity that can also continue into a future administration. The EPA program, as part of the IRA, is also critical to this and the sort of the more harmonization side. But if the federal government decides to get more ambitious, it can. If it decides to engage with PCR processes or start its own, it can. I think there's a big role here, but again, that longevity aspect is also pretty important. There was a law called the Clean Future Act that did not pass, but it would have done a lot of things that the Buy Clean Task Force is doing, but through legislation. And so it, has a longer shelf life when you do something through legislation. But I think those aspects are key.
Should the federal government provide the guidelines for rules and regulations for a single standard? Anybody? Chris?
I'll let someone else lead on that one if they want to.
Okay, Kate, how about you?
An interesting question, Bill. I hadn't really thought about that until now. I guess from my prior work with EPA on the Eco Logo and EPP development of that program, what we've seen is the EPA playing a role developing guidance and requirements for certification programs. And so I could see a similar type of role here. I don't know that I'd want to think a little bit further about having the government develop product category rules before I'd necessarily endorse that proposal,
though. I would just add the advantage of that, if it happens, is that you would get a more uniform set of rules around the country, and there is some advantage of that.
What about the timeline? We only have one or two Buy Clean policies or regulations that have already passed. It's going to maybe take a year or more to get more in. And that, as you pointed out, is primarily for public buildings. And so by the time, and most of them start with all you need to do is submit EPDs. So by the time you roll through this, it will be maybe end of 23, 24 before we actually have an EPD database for at least a couple of products to really work with other than industry standards. And then the regulations need to be created, and then you need to have some time to notice period, maybe a year for the industry to get started. And in fact, then it really doesn't come into impact a couple of years down the line when people go to get permits to put up their buildings. So you're looking at at best, maybe 27 or 28 for the start of any real benefits from this. So, it's very easy to be passive and sort of say, well, this is what it is. But we are creating regulation. So is there any way that we can move this forward?
I mean, I think we're certainly racing against time, but there are very known constraints that we have to deal with. And it will take a combination of regulation, private-public partnership, with trade organizations that represent business interests, and be able to come up with PCRs that can be scaled and outline some sort of incremental progress to get towards our 2030 goals. I think the ultimate objective is we will get there. And the challenge is how soon, but there are real challenges that we have to also figure out that makes it more inclusive, but also open and transparent.
Okay, I see you coming on, Madison, to let us know we're at 12:30. So we have 14 minutes. We can answer some questions. Let me just sort of wrap this up by saying there's a lot to unpack here, but it's clear that we need short-term gains. If you look around outside, concrete is everywhere. Reducing cement use by 15% will cut 1 billion tons of CO2 every 2 to 3 years. So I'm not going to recommend, let's start by using less cement. So let's move on to some of the questions. There's a bunch in here. I just want to, some people are making comments, but let's get to some questions. So here's one. I hear that EPDs and therefore PCRs do not cover land use change very well. For example, a steel mine can dam up a large rainforest valley to gain power, but that is classified as hydro and no emissions recorded. There are many examples. How can a PCR account for land use change, et cetera? And how can wood products document forestry management? Anybody want to weigh in on that?
I'll start that one off.
Sure.
Let's see. So ISO 21930 is the international standard for development of PCRs and EPDs of construction products. It does require land use change to be accounted for if it's significant. So that's the language, and that's not, and so that is it may be more intuitive for certain types of products, where if you have a forest that's been converted from one type to another, that would trigger that. This example with a dam in the Amazon is an interesting one. That would take some additional investigation to make sure that the land use change was properly calculated in the LCA. Sorry, Bill, there was two parts to that question. What was the second part?
The second part, I just lost it. Oh, here it is. There are many examples. How can PCRs account for land use change, et cetera? How can wood products document?
Wood products, thank you.
Yeah, okay.
So the standard that I referenced, ISO 21930, for wood products, the guidance that it has applied is that if if the wood's coming from a forest that is either FSC or PEFC certified, or SFI, which is the equivalent, then it's considered to be a carbon neutral wood source. So that's a simplifying assumption, which is in that standard, based on the idea that the wood is being sourced from a well-managed forest. There's also an allowance in that standard that if on a national basis, it can be demonstrated that the overall forest coverage is increasing over time, that same assumption of carbon neutrality can be applied. But if the wood sourced from outside of those situations, then that would not be a valid assumption under that standard. There is some criticism, I'll say, and research within the LCA community on trying to really advance the subject so that we're not using that simplifying assumption and really looking at the forest landscape itself to understand how management of that forest is affecting carbon storage across the landscape. And there's emerging work, but I see that as still evolving and forthcoming before there's going to be guidance ready on how to do those calculations.
Thanks. Here is an anonymous attendee question, but it's interesting, and actually, Fatu, this might interest you. is there any movement by GSA to look at these issues for renovation tenant improvement projects? The requirements for new building prospectus construction is much stricter, and there don't seem to be any requirements, guidance for renovations, tenants improvements currently.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's all about context, right? When we talk about renovations, how substantial is that renovation? If you have a single tenant in a building that's doing a renovation that's 50% larger than the construction cost of that, then it will kick in. And again, if you have multiple tenants in there and the renovation job that they're doing doesn't qualify as to what substantial means, then it probably wouldn't apply. But these are different scenarios that has to be addressed depending on what stage the project is at.
Right. Actually, I think that New York State under Executive Order 22 is covering renovations, and I think that if I recollect, that the guideline was that if the cost of a renovation or a reuse project was 50% or more
of the budget,
of new construction, that was going to come under this requirement.
That's right.
EPDs, is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct, and it's irrelevant if it's tenant or owner, as long as that percentage applies, then the compliance that goes into effect.
Okay. So here's an interesting question. What are the hallmarks of low carbon building materials? Is it use of clean energy in the production of such materials, or are there other elements to reducing embodied carbon in such materials?
I don't know that there's a simple answer to that one, Bill. I mean, and I think that's one of the things I really appreciate about LCA is that it gives us an opportunity to really investigate and identify where those hot spots are. I thought it was a good point. I think you made that earlier, Bill. But in the case of cement, while it's only using a small percentage, I think it was 8% of the energy use, but responsible for over 50% of the CO2 emissions of the concrete. So that's an area where clean energy would not necessarily have the effect that you would expect on the product, but other products like steel produced using an electric arc furnace is going to be largely driven by the carbon intensity of the energy grid. So I don't have a simple answer for that one, but it's an interesting question.
Okay, here's another one. How are these declarations and LCAs considered in calculating or estimating Scope 3 emissions? Keith, can you do that one?
Yeah, I'll tackle that one because this comes up quite a bit. Yeah. So when we're looking at corporate greenhouse gas reporting, these are classified into Scope 1, 2, and Scope 3. We use a different framework when we're looking at the impacts from a life cycle assessment perspective, and we don't use that terminology. Instead, we think of it as looking at the inputs and outputs from each stage of the life cycle of the product. And so Scope 3 would include things like employee commute and business travel. Those things are typically excluded from an LCA and an EPD of a product because those are not directly tied to manufacture the product.
Okay. Here's one, which is an interesting, a good one, I think. If EPDs cost at a minimum about $1,000 per product line, how can small suppliers compete in providing EPDs for public projects? So if I recollect, wasn't there some kind of funding, Ken, do you remember in IRA possibly available to fund EPDs? Ken, your microphone is off.
Yeah, there's certainly significant funding in the the IRA to address that. Eventually, as you do this kind of work, you see smaller companies generally are as these areas develop, they're held to slightly different standards than bigger companies. They may be able to rely on data. They may not have to do all the work themselves. So there's always an attempt to balance this out a little bit so that smaller companies can compete in these markets. Keith, you may want to add to that, but I think there can be efforts to try and address that issue.
Don't have a lot to add, Ken, but I think that's a great point. And I just recall, this may have expired at this point, but when Buy Clean was initially launched, I think it was the LA chapter of USGBC was providing funding for small and medium enterprises to develop EPDs. So I expect there'll be other resources available too for these small companies.
Okay, here's one. I know we are working or beginning stages of wanting to do a construction demolition facility, but that is more on the back end of solutions. Keith, you want to address that? I guess the full, the whole life cycle.
Yeah, I'm not sure I caught all of that. I think what I was understanding was that the a question about how are the impacts looked at perhaps at the end of life or deconstruction of a building. Is that right, Bill?
Yes, I think it's a general question on that.
Yeah. For an EPD, we'll look at this from the perspective of the product. So what it takes to remove the product from the building, and to be transparent, there's not a lot of great data on this. Sometimes we'll have to assume it's a manual process done with tools. So more research and more data would be beneficial on the impacts from deconstruction of buildings and LCA data sets, I would say.
Actually, and that makes me ask a question, because I've noticed in some of the buy clean policies that are coming down the pipeline, they're looking for, full life cycle data from cradle to grave, not cradle to gate. And so, what is that doing to this whole process? Because that really isn't available, and a lot of it is supposition, in fact. So, how do you feel about, throwing that into the mix now in new buy clean policies?
Is that to me again, Bill?
To anybody, yes. Fatu, you're not on Fatu.
Okay. So I was just going to say, cradle to grave assessment, New York City Construction Authority that I gave as an example is already using that on their public projects. Now, there's a lot of lesson to be learned from them. And I think from the city's perspective, leading by example, we're using existing frameworks that have already been there. So to expand on doing more public projects that are going to need to use a cradle to grave EPD scope is something that's been done. So it can be leveraged and expanded on some of these city-funded projects.
Okay. But my question is this: in other words, it seems that there were so few cradle to grave EPDs out there, and so now if the city comes along and says, "All right, you have to submit this now,"
yeah. I think. I mean, I hate to take the shortcut, but the reality of it is that there's not very materials that are available today that are cradle to grave. A city verified database, as I suggested, or a state verified database, as I suggested earlier, would be something that compliance perspective that they'll put together, as it states in the law, that they will provide more guidance down the line because of the non-existence of some of these EPDs, or just the quantity of it isn't there. And we'll just have, there's going to be a lot of lessons to learn, is what I would say to that.
Ken, how do you feel about this? About requiring now, when they're not really available, these whole life cycle EPDs to, for compliance?
Well, it depends a lot on the product and how much the various stages of life cycle really influence it. If 90% comes from of the carbon emissions come from, let's say, the manufacturing and development of the product, then maybe you can stop with that because it's much simpler and you get your EPDs much faster. And I don't know whether is it even the capability in the industry to do hundreds of thousands of life cycle assessments in a relatively short period of time. So that's another issue that has to be looked at on this. I mean, I think we want to set up a system that gets to the essence of the issue, that captures the vast majority of these emissions, but tries to keep things relatively, as simple as you can in doing that.
Okay, well, I think we are just about time. I'm sure Madison is about to appear. Thank you all for joining with me for this very interesting conversation and looking at the details of what it takes to do this.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to all of our speakers, and thank you, Bill, for helping organize this. We so appreciate your time and your presentations. And this event is recorded, so it will be posted on ELI's website in the next couple of business days. If you have any questions, feel free to email me, and just thank you all once again. Have a great day.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thank you.